This is Ben. Today I'll be talking about the indie game Gris, developed by Nomada Studio and published by Developer Digital in 2018. At a glance, Gris looks like a simple puzzle platformer with beautiful watercolor visuals. But underneath that artistic presentation is a much deeper emotional story about grief, healing, and personal growth. What makes the game unique is that it tells the story almost entirely without dialogue, instead communicating emotion through color, music, movement, and environmental design. Today I want to discuss the game's gameplay, story structure, artistic direction, emotional themes, and why it became such an important example of games being used as emotional storytelling experiences rather than just simple entertainment. Gris is a 2D puzzle platforming game where the player controls a young girl named Gris as she travels through a shattered world. The game begins with Gris losing her voice while standing in the hands of a giant crumbling statue. After that statue collapses, she falls into a colorless world and begins a journey to restore both the environment and herself. As the player progresses, new colors will slowly return to the world, each section introducing new mechanics and emotional symbolism connected to Gris's own mental health and emotional recovery. Critics and scholars commonly interpret this game as representing the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. According to the academic article, a study of color analysis about sensitive healing game Gris, the game intentionally uses changing colors to symbolize emotional healing and psychological progression throughout the journey. Unlike many platform games, Gris contains no traditional combat, spoken dialogue, and almost no text. Instead, the experience focuses on atmosphere, exploration, and emotional immersion. The game was praised heavily for its artistic style, soundtrack, and emotional storytelling, winning multiple awards for visual design and animation. From a gameplay perspective, Gris is relatively simple. Players move through environments by jumping, climbing, swimming, floating, and solving environmental puzzles. However, the mechanics are tied directly to the emotional progression of the character. At the beginning of the game, Gris can't even jump properly. This is meant to reflect emotional weakness and instability. And as the game progresses, she gains new abilities that symbolize her own recovery and personal growth. For example, she gains the ability to turn into a block to break through obstacles. Later she can float gracefully through the air, and eventually she learns how to swim and move freely underwater. Instead of becoming stronger through violence or combat, Gris becomes stronger through acceptance and perseverance. The puzzles themselves are generally not extremely difficult. This is intentional because the developers want players to focus more on emotional pacing and atmosphere rather than frustration or challenges. The academic study Gris, Grief, and the Heroine's Journey explains that the game's mechanics mirror the emotional transformation of the main character. The article arguing that every new ability represents a stage of emotional adaptation and healing rather than traditional power progression found in most games. This makes gameplay itself part of the storytelling experience. The central theme of Gris is grief. Many interpretations connect the game to Kubler-Ross's model of grief, which includes denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Each emotional stage is represented visually through environments and color palettes, and even through the game's own achievements. The early gray environments reflect emptiness and denial. The red desert section symbolizes anger and emotional struggle. Blue underwater areas represent sadness and depression, while the yellow sections later in the game symbolize hope and acceptance. What makes Gris especially powerful is it never directly explains loss. Players are left to interpret the story themselves through symbolism and imagery. Throughout the game, broken statues and collapsing structures will repeatedly appear. Many players interpret these statues as representing something important that Gris lost. Maybe a family member, maybe even a loved one. One of the strongest academic analyses of the game comes from The Aesthetics of Grief, exploring sorrow in the paradigm of Gris. The article explains that Gris communicates grief through nonverbal emotional design, meaning that visuals, sounds, movements, and environmental symbolism replace the traditional dialogue and narration. This is important because grief is often difficult to explain verbally in real life. The game is meant to capture that emotional confusion by focusing on atmosphere and symbolism rather than direct explanation. The same study also argues that the game creates empathy by allowing the players to actively experience emotional recovery through gameplay rather than simply observing it. One of the most praised aspects of Gris is its art direction. The visuals resemble watercolor paintings brought to life. Every scene feels hand-painted, with soft colors, fluid animations, and dreamlike landscapes. The art design by Spanish artist Conrad Rosette, whose illustration style heavily influenced the game's emotional tone. The lack of dialogue strengthens the visual storytelling because players focus more on symbolism and atmosphere. A lot of critics compare the game to an interactive painting rather than a traditional game. Another academic article titled From Silence to Color, Gris in the Aesthetics of Mourning in the Spanish indie game, explains how the game uses silence and color transition to visually represent mourning and emotional resilience. The article itself also discusses how the game's environments gradually become more detailed and alive as Gris emotionally recovers. Another important detail is how animation reflects emotion. Early in the game, Gris will move slowly and appear physically weak. However, her movements later become a lot more graceful and confident. Even the enemies and obstacles reflect emotional struggles rather than physical danger. One recurring shadow creature can be interpreted as fear, anxiety, internal trauma, maybe even grief itself. The soundtrack of Gris, composed by the band Berlinist, is another major reason the game became so popular. The music changes dramatically depending on the emotional tone of each scene. Quiet piano melodies are used during moments of sadness or isolation, while larger orchestral sections appear during emotional breakthroughs. Because there is almost no spoken dialogue, I've said before, the soundtrack has to carry a lot of the emotional weight of the experience. The opening scene especially is effective. Gris attempts to sing, but her voice breaks apart as the statue holding her collapses. The moment itself immediately establishes the themes of emotional loss and silence. The academic article, The Aesthetics of Grief, Exploring Sorrow and the Paradigm of Gris, specifically highlights how music and silence work together to create emotional immersion. According to the article, the soundtrack acts almost like an emotional narrator for the player. Gris became important because it demonstrates that games can communicate emotional and psychological experiences in artistic ways. Many games focus on competition, combat, or action. Gris focuses on healing, reflection, emotional vulnerability, development. The developers even consulted legitimate psychologists during development to better represent the themes of grief and depression. The game also proved that indie games could explore serious emotional topics while still being commercially successful. Academic researchers have used Gris as an example of how interactive media can create emotional empathy. Instead of watching a character suffer, players directly participate in the emotional journey through interaction and exploration, something you can't catch in most forms of media. This level of immersion makes the emotional impact much stronger, or because of it. Because the story is symbolic rather than explicit, many players connect the game to their own personal experience with grief, depression, loneliness, and their own recovery. In conclusion, Gris is a lot more than a puzzle platform game. Through its visuals, its music, symbolism, and gameplay mechanics, it creates a deeply emotional experience about grief and healing. The game shows how interactive media can communicate emotions in ways that movies or books sometimes just can't. Instead of simply watching a character struggle emotionally, players actively move through that emotional journey themselves. It gives them a stake in the story. Academic studies on the game have shown how Gris uses color theory, emotional storytelling, music, and and symbolic gameplay to explore mourning and emotional recovery in a much more meaningful way than other media can usually provide. Its use of silence, watercolor visuals, its emotional symbolism. It makes it one of the strongest examples of why games can be treated as art. And even years after its release, Gris continues to be remembered not for its difficult gameplay or its action, but the impact it'll lift on its players. And I think that means a lot more. Thank you.